request our honorable principal sir, Professor K.K. Arora, to offer his preliminary remarks. Welcome you, sir.
Good evening, all of you, and Professor Skaria, good morning to you.
Good morning. Good evening.
So, Honorable Professor Ajay Skaria, Professor Bindu Puri, Dr. Sanjeev Kumar, other distinguished guests, our faculty members, and dear students. Now, it's my great pleasure and honor to welcome you all at this 5th session of the distinguished lecture series organized by Gandhi Study Circle of our Zakir Hussain Delhi College. Zakir Hussain Delhi College, as you know, is leading college of University of Delhi, imparting higher education in science, commerce, humanities, and social sciences. The college carries itself a history of more than 300 years. And since its inception, the college has stood for merging tradition with modernity and constantly striving towards progress. This gives college a distinctly diverse cultural ambience and cherishes composite culture and a spirit of mutual accommodation. Continuing this rich legacy of the college, we are extremely happy that Gandhi Study Circle has recently instituted a lecture series to commemorate the life and philosophy of Mahatma Gandhi. Although our colleague, Dr. Sanjeev Kumar, has been working on different aspects of Gandhi for last many years under this Gandhi Study Circle, and he has done a lot. He has taught to students different aspects, and he has taken many trips of the students to different places where they can learn about Gandhi. I wish to congratulate the convener, Dr. Sanjeev Kumar, and other faculty members for this type of endeavor, where the students in these days are trying to learn and still, I'll say, learning about Gandhi. We are truly grateful to our eminent guest, Professor Ajay Skaria, where definitely we are going to have a very nice lecture, and I'm sure that all the listeners will definitely acquire another view on Gandhian philosophy. Although I'll apologize, Dr. Skaria, that I will not be able to continue because I am in the office and I have to upload certain information regarding admission on the university portal and before 7 o'clock. So I will not be able to continue, but if that work is over and still I find lecture is going on, I will definitely join back. And once again, I extend my warm welcome to all the participants, eminent scholars from academia and outside, my faculty members and students for joining this important discussion today. I'll say once again, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to say a few words. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for your encouraging words. In fact, Professor Arora has always been there. Whatever initiatives we have been conducting through the pandemic times and otherwise, I think the institution has always supported us. So thank you so much, sir, for being here. And of course, I would be happy if you can continue.
Yes, after
discussion.
uploading this data on the university website, if the lecture is still continuing, I'll definitely join back. I'm still in the office.
Thank you so much, sir. We are also extremely fortunate and honored to have amongst us today two very distinguished scholars, whose life and works have been of great inspiration to us. Professor Bindu Puri, who will chair this important session today, is a professor of contemporary Indian philosophy at the Center of Philosophy, School of Social Sciences, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Earlier, she worked as a chairperson of the center. She has been interested in issues in political philosophy, moral philosophy, and contemporary Indian philosophy. Professor Puri is a leading scholar on the thought and practice of Mahatma Gandhi. She has published extensively in edited anthologies and philosophical and interdisciplinary journals. On a personal note, I have gained enormously from the interactions and association working with her. She has always encouraged, supported, and inspired me to pursue Gandhi scholarship, an area that I recently ventured to explore and learning from it. Professor Ajay Skaria, the keynote speaker of today's lecture, is an eminent professor in the Department of History and Institute for Global Studies at the University of Minnesota. Since the 2000s, his research interests have been in 20th century Indian intellectual history, modern caste politics, and post-colonial theory. In addition to these articles in these fields, he has been the author of many important books that includes Hybrid Histories, Forest, Frontiers, and Wildness in Western India, and the celebrated Unconditional Equality, Gandhi's Religion of Resistance, and has also co-edited Subaltern Studies, Volume 12, Muslim, Dalits, and Fabrications of History. And Dipesh Chakravarti and Global South, co-edited work has been recently published. So all of you can look out for that. He's also working currently on two very important books, Ambedkar's Revolutions, which explores the trope of revolution in Ambedkar's thinking of law and Buddhism, and another untitled work exploring through attention to Gandhi, Ambedkar, Nehru, and other mid-20th century thinkers, the relation between secularism and political friendship or neighborliness. He was a member of the Subaltern Studies editorial collectives from 1995 till its dissolution. Professor Skaria's intellectual world of postcolonial studies is wholly anchored within modern secular European thought, whether of liberal, Marxist, or postmodernist strains. But I must say Mahatma Gandhi has remained a topic of special interest to him. To read Gandhi from such a vantage point is, of course, a challenge. But Professor Skaria has attempted to think through the tensions in Gandhi's writing, speeches, and acts without dismissing them as hopeless contradictions, unlike many critiques of the Western world. His Unconditional Equality, Gandhi's Religion of Resistance, is a classic work, and I suggest all of you to read that. It's a classic work in contemporary moral philosophy that draws upon a new conception of religion that disavows all claims to sovereignty, even over oneself. He's amongst few scholars engaging Gandhi today. I just today came to know that he's a Malayali, but he draws upon Gandhi's writing in both Gujarati original and English translation, and has successfully established a novel way of studying Gandhi by not being content with reading and rereadings of the original text alone, but also comparing notes with contemporary thought, all the while paying attention to the original cultural context. We are truly honored to have you here with us today. He will be speaking on a theme, a very important theme, non-willing freedom, how Gandhi matters today. Before I request the chair, Professor Puri, to introduce the theme and take the proceedings forward, I quickly want to make a few announcements. Participants are requested to keep their audios off during the conduct of the proceedings. After the lecture, we will have an interactive session for 30 minutes. This will be moderated by our friend Priyanshu. Not taking much of your time, may I now request Professor Bindu Puri to offer her introductory remarks and conduct the proceedings further. Professor Puri, welcome.
Thank you so much. I think it's really a wonderful opportunity for me to be here at this platform. And Sanjeev Kumarji has been working very doing a lot of work as a meticulous scholar, and produced a beautiful volume in which I was also fortunate to contribute, and also as an organizer and in spreading a lot of awareness about Gandhiji's ideals, and also engaging students in both his practice as well as his ideas. And it's been really wonderful to be able to be working with him for so long. I think I'm really fortunate that I came to meet him when I did, and I could share his journey in with the students at Zakir Hussain College, and I've been able to go there very many times. And it's a wonderful honor for me here to be sharing Professor Skaria's talk. And like I told him, I'm a very big fan, if I can say that, as an academic fan. And his book is something which I mean, I've got it here, and I've literally torn it because I read it all the time. And I think every 6 months, I like to read it anew to learn something. And as I think I get a chance to speak after the talk, right? So I'd like to give my comments after hearing him. And though I don't always agree, but I think what's so important is that by giving us all this wonderful food for thought, he has provoked so many debates in different directions, with so many scholars taking off from where he stops and trying to go, trying to look at his arguments. And also, I have personally used so many of his ideas to guide my own work. For instance, I love this beautiful idea he's put forth on satyagraha as an equality of deference. And I think it really, I've got a book on the Gandhi Ambedkar debate in press with Springer right now. And I think a lot of my interest in equality in Gandhi came from that idea over there. So that was beautiful. And that's a personal, I've never met him till today, but I feel I know him very well because I read him so much. So I think without much ado, we will like to hear him. So I'd like to invite Professor Skaria to give his address.
Thank you. Thank you for such a generous introduction, Sanjeev. And thank you so much for your very kind remarks, Bindu. I look forward to reading the book when it's out. It's truly a pleasure to be here with all of you. This is in a sense, since you mentioned the book, this is a kind of return to the themes of the book on a different register. It's now almost 20 years since I began working on Gandhi. If you'd asked me even a year before, whether I would say in 1999, whether I would work on Gandhi, I would have emphatically said no. And in the leftist circles that I was part of when I was a student in Vadodara and later Cambridge in the late 80s and early 90s, critiques of Gandhi were very, very commonplace, right? For his sexism, for his casteism, for the way he was seen as having enabled the consolidation of a conservative Hinduism, right? Then, as now, it was impossible to read Gandhi's explicit arguments without a sense of profound disquiet, sometimes even outrage. For example, his repeated defense of Varna Dharma, his claim that only he and not Ambedkar could speak for the untouchables, as he, or that moment when he cuts the hair of two girls in his ashram because boys have cast a quote-unquote evil eye on them, right? And the scholarship around me at that time confirmed that feeling. Indeed, in terms of characterizing Gandhi's overall impact, the work of Ranajit Guha, Shahid Amin, David Hardiman, and Partha Chatterjee offered a renewed critique of Gandhi, which still rings true in many ways, because part of what they are saying is that, as Partha put it, Gandhi's ideology acquires tremendous power because it enables the political hegemony in a new nation state. Ranajit Guha says some things that are even sharper. Because I broadly agree with this assessment and still agree with it, right? I thought that the critique of Gandhi as of his religion was in the main complete, and that what remained was intellectually not interesting enough to work on. That's what I'd have said if you'd asked me in 2006. But increasingly, I've come to feel that while many of these critiques are entirely correct and should even be sharpened, they can, if made too quickly, also obscure from us what is most radical in Gandhi, right? His questioning of a will-centered politics. Indeed, they are in some senses made possible because we don't pay attention to his questioning of a will-centered politics, right? And such a questioning remains indispensable for a democratic politics today, even if it must necessarily proceed by relinquishing many of Gandhi's specific formulations and positions. To indicate why and how this questioning of a will-centered politics is essential, I would like to start by drawing a contrast between two ways of rendering a famous slogan, right? The slogan liberty, equality, fraternity. You know, of course, that the slogan is associated with the French Revolution. You know? I should stress, however, that I do not think it is useful to think of that slogan or of the ideas associated with that slogan as quintessentially European. As you likely know, that slogan itself only radicalizes some of the themes that were already there a decade earlier in the American Revolution. And in that revolution, blacks too played a role, even if they were quickly marginalized once the revolution was completed. Then again, the slogan found a home in 1804, less than 2 decades later, in the Haitian Revolution, right? Where, in other words, what I'm trying to say is that liberty, equality, fraternity is best understood as part of a global movement, a moment that took off in the 18th and 19th century and was characterized by the attempt to imagine equality and freedom as a people. So liberty, equality, fraternity, if you think of that phrase carefully, it condenses within it a question: how to be free as a people, right? You know, how to be free together. Yeah. And that question, how to be free and equal as a people, is a question that we have been in the grip of ever since the 18th century. It is this question and our various attempts to quilt a just answer to this question which describes our political modernity. So that's why, you know, when there's this response sometimes ascribed to Deng, the Chinese leader, who, when he's asked what he thinks of the French Revolution, says it is too early to say. I suspect, in a sense, whether he meant it or not, you know, I would see it as acknowledging the way that the idea of liberty, equality, fraternity is central to our modernity. I think we can describe two broad ways of answering the question of how to be free and equal as a people. One is a way centered around affirming the will of the people, and the second is the way centered around relinquishing the will of the people, or at least having a skeptical relationship with the will of the people.
It's 8 o'clock.
Sorry, I should have put off my speaker, my timer for. The dominant answer, the almost ubiquitous answer, has been in terms of the way, or has been around the way centered around the affirmation of the will of the people. And the other one, attempting to relinquish the will, has been much more marginal. So much so that we do not even usually recognize it as another path. But it has never quite disappeared from view. And from its concealment, it is even very, very important. I would even say that it sometimes, you know, determines our answers centered on the will of the people. And in our current times, thematizing it explicitly may be more important than ever. Now, Gandhi is one of the very few political actors committed to acting in a way that relinquishes or constantly steps back from the will. You can almost count on your fingers the prominent figures in active politics who were committed to the way of non-willing freedom. Gandhi, Ambedkar, Howard Thurman, Martin Luther King, Simone Weil, right, etc. And of course, there are many lesser known figures, but I'm just pointing to the ones who usually come to mind. And when you come to political philosophers, again, those who think of a politics outside the will are very, very few, right? Most of all, classically in the 19th century, in the 20th century, Simone Weil, Hannah Arendt, Heidegger. I would say in many ways, if you come slightly later, I would think of the whole Derridian tradition as also questioning the will. So, of course, none of these political actors or philosophers ever explicitly lay out a liberty, equality, and fraternity centered around relinquishing the will. This is not surprising, really. It is always the fate of those who think really new thoughts to not be able to entirely discern the newness of what they do, to articulate it in contradictory ways, to struggle to put it in words. It is only latecomers like us who might be able to see patterns that were not discernible to those actors and philosophers who think the truly new. So this contrast between two politics, one centered around the will and the other centered around relinquishing the will, is at the heart of Gandhi's politics. This is why he contrasts two visions of Swaraj, one that he calls parliamentary Swaraj and the other that he calls true Swaraj. And what he calls parliamentary Swaraj is what I'm here calling the way centered around affirming the will. What he calls true Swaraj is what I'm here describing as the way centered around relinquishing the will. Yeah? So that's the broad framing within which I want to speak today. And in order to tease out how Gandhi matters today, what I would like to do is briefly address 4 questions, right? First, what is a politics that affirms the will of the people? I'd like to schematically revisit that question, which so many people have written about already. Second, what is distinctive about parliamentary Swaraj or republican democracy as a form of will-centered politics? Third, what would be involved in a politics that relinquishes the will? Fourth, what is the relationship between these two politics, the politics that affirms the will and the politics that relinquishes the will? So these are the 4 questions that frame what I'm going to say. I'll just go through each of them one by one. Yeah. So let's begin with the first. How to describe a politics that affirms the will of the people? Which requires asking, of course, first, what is the will? Simplifying massively, as you know, the literature on the will is enormous. You can see that exercising the will involves 3 intertwined aspects. One, it involves acting to realize what I wish to do. If I have a wish, but I do not act on that wish, then I cannot be said to be exercising my will. I would merely be indulging in my daydreams. 2, to exercise the will involves mastering a situation. Yeah. So the object on which I exercise mastery may be natural forces. Say when I undertake to build something, it may be non-human animals, say the process of domestication. It may be other humans, say a factory. But in every case, exercising the will involves exercising mastery over. Third, even if I simply exercise mastery over something, I am not necessarily exercising my will. I am exercising a will only if my wishes are not simply desires that have overcome me. If I have been overcome by my desires, then I am a slave to them and I cannot be said to be exercising my will. These 3, you can say are the most rudimentary features of the way we usually understand the will and what therefore a will of the people is centered around. Now, of course, so far I've talked of the will as though we are dealing with individuals, right? And as you know, we are not here talking of individuals, we are talking of society. And when we talk of society, we have to add another concept to the mix: authority. The concept of authority, which I think actually we've been very inadequately attentive to. The concept of authority describes a symbolic and generative locus of the political. It is a principle that governs a society because it is widely accepted. If you're exercising authority over me, you are not willing me to do something. What is distinctive about authority is that you and I both accept the legitimacy of the order where you command. That authority draws its force, will over me. So if you want to think of an almost textbook example of authority, it could be the pre-modern caste hierarchy and the way it functioned most of the time, though never all the time. Both in the pre-modern world and today, a tyrant would be one who exercises will or mastery without authority, who may not even care to claim authority, right? So therefore, I think, tyranny represents, and again, I'm here really drawing on Hannah Arendt's beautiful essay on authority, right? Now, I'm just like to stress some more things about authority for our times. Authority as a concept does quite different work from hegemony, right? Even if it redescribes some of the same phenomena. The concept of hegemony is within and arises, the concept of hegemony arises within the problematic of the will. To say that somebody is hegemonic is to dispute the idea that people are acting under their own will. Yes. So to that extent, both share an emphasis on autonomy, on questioning the will. But it is to suggest that the will is to be located not in persons and individuals, but in certain ideologies, in materialized ideas, and that some of these materialized ideas have become commonsensical enough to appear to actors as the manifestation of their own will. Right? By contrast to both these phenomena, this is to hegemony basically, authority names the moment when we freely split ourselves, accept that we are not operating under our own will, and when we conceive the other under whose aegis we act, not in terms of a will, but in terms of what is proper. Now, with modernity, one of the things that happens is that the locus of authority shifts to the people. With this, when sovereigns exercise their will, they claim their authority from the people. Again, I would stress that this is not only some European phenomenon that spreads outwards. Right? For example, quite independent of any European influence, you have the rhetoric in India of Maratha Swaraj, of Jat communities claiming rule, etc. Yeah. These are obviously not people in the modern sense. But the idea that the sovereign claims authority not from some order that stands independent of both the rule and the rule, not from some assent from the from the consonance with the rule, but rather as a representative of the rule. In this idea, we already have an incipient concept of authority, an incipient concept of the people. And of course, in the centuries since then, this tendency to claim authority or sanction from the people has only increased. Today, even the most brutally repressive regimes would claim to rule in the name of the people, right? This is the sense in which I say that there are politics that claims authority from the people, that claims it only represents their will, has become dominant with modernity. Indeed, every nationalist movement that seeks to establish itself in the form of the state is nothing but an assertion that it is the will of the people, and therefore it should prevail. When Tilak says that Swaraj is his birthright, What he's saying is that the will of the people should determine the forms of rule in India. And this emphasis on the will of the people is something that is shared across the political spectrum. If you think of the Marxist tradition, for example, including Marx himself most of the time, running through it is the argument that liberal democracies only obfuscate the will of the people, obfuscate it even from the people themselves, that what is needed is a realization instead of a socialist will, right? This is the sense in which I'm saying that the will of the people is the hegemonic imaginary across the political system, and that in a way, if I have to bring these two concepts together, I might say that hegemony and authority together, I might say that will-centered politics has hegemonized the imagination so much so that there is no easy exit from it. Indeed, the very possibility of an exit boggles the imagination, which is why the few thinkers and political actors who have attempted an exit have often gone down so many dead alleys or tied themselves up in knots. And I think this happens to Gandhi, this happens to Heidegger, this happens to Derrida. I mean, so it's not surprising that it happens because they are thinkers of the new, and that is, I think, perhaps one of the dangers that you run into. So much for the first question, right? What is its concept of the will? Second, now let me turn to the second question, which is what is distinctive about what Gandhi calls parliamentary swaraj as a way of articulating the will of the people. As you can see in the very phrase, right, the will of the people is a collective thing. That this hypostatized entity, the people, includes all the residents of a land or country is not at all necessary. For example, historically in the United States, when they said the will of the people, it certainly did not include African Americans and Native Americans. And in every nation state, only citizens constitute the people, not refugees or non-citizens. And even within citizens, there are hierarchies. It is much easier for whites in the United States or Hindus in India to claim to be part of the people. So the will of the people works usually in profoundly exclusionary ways, right? And it is in this context, right, that the languages of liberal democracy and republican democracy are important. The two are liberal democracy and republican democracy are not the same, though they are often practically indiscernible from each other and are complementary, and each bears the potentiality of the other. And the term parliamentary swaraj connotes both. So just to describe very quickly the difference between them, liberal democracy is the coming together of two forms of the will. On the one side, democracy, with its emphasis on the will of the people, and on the other side, liberalism, with its emphasis on the primacy of the will of individuals embodied in their rights. This is why liberalism by itself need not be democratic, for example, in a constitutional monarchy. The democracy need not be liberal, for example, in a populist order. Or indeed that liberal democracies can be founded on apartheid, South Africa historically, Israel today. That liberalism can be part of colonialism, for example, the British Empire, or imperialism and racism, for example, the United States today, right? So minimally, what liberal democracy does is that it inscribes negative rights. My freedom from being coerced to act against my will, my freedom from the state, my freedom from the will of the people even. In other words, what negative right says is that, save in the most exceptional circumstances, the will of the people as embodied in the state cannot and must not override my will as an individual. And that, moreover, other individuals or groups too must not have the power to override my will as an individual. Right? As you can see, this kind of negative right is absolutely crucial to liberal democracy. Maximally, liberal democracy also inscribes positive rights. It tries to build up which is to say, it tries to build up our ability to exercise our will. After all, the right to do something means nothing if one is so disempowered that one cannot actually do it. Without power, there is no exercise of the will possible. So unless citizens are socially and economically empowered, it does not mean much to say that they are free to exercise their will. And this distinction between negative and positive rights, a very famous distinction, as you all know, is only one aspect of the way that the will of the people is recognized as not one, but many, as incapable of being made one, as having many domains of action. For example, as important as the distinction between negative and public rights and positive rights, maybe even more important, is the distinction between public and private rights. So liberal democracy is one aspect, one way that you can render parliamentary swaraj. It's how the will of the people is recognized as plural, and how this plurality of wills is protected, at least in principle, against domination by any one fraction of the will that claims to speak for the whole. Now, to describe this division and pluralization of the will, the political philosopher Claude Lefort had a very nice phrase: the empty place of power. To draw on his terms, what is distinctive about liberal democracy is that it rests on the premise that power belongs to no one, that those who exercise power do not possess it, that they do not indeed embody it, that the exercise of power requires a periodic and repeated contest, that the authority of those vested with power is created and recreated as a result of the manifestation of the will of the people, unquote. And this will of the people is itself determined in ways that try to avoid the people acting in unison. This is why we vote individually, right? In secret, so to speak. And it is only through millions of such solitary acts of the will that the will of the people is supposed to be determined, right? So that's one aspect of parliamentary democracy, which is a more familiar aspect. The other aspect of parliamentary swaraj is what I would call republican democracy, the separation of will from authority, right? The necessity for the will to be complemented and supplemented by authority. The most visible way in which republican democracy manifests its difference is the division of power into different branches of the government. What we often do not heed enough is that this division is also a division between authority and the will. Rather than the executive branch simply claiming authority from the periodic mandates of elections, republican democracy institutionalizes will in the executive and authority in the legislative and the judiciary. This institutionalized division of will from authority is what makes democracy republican. To anchor democracy in authority is not only to sanction and sanctify the will, it is also to significantly modulate the will, even on occasion to suspend the will. Right? To be bound by the law, thus, is not only to act within the bounds of the law. It could also involve acting in the spirit of the law rather than in the spirit of our own will. Yeah. So I would also stress this, that republican democracy is not only a form of government, even if that is what it most evidently appears as. It is also a personal and social comportment, a manner of conducting ourselves in accordance with authority. Here, however, authority is transformed because authority is no longer hierarchical, but democratic. What would democratic authority mean? Democratic authority would mean that I accord you respect and even maybe submit to you, not because we both accept an order which decrees your superiority, but because I, and maybe you, accept an order which decrees your moral equality. This moral equality involves being free in a way very different from liberal democracies. In the spirit of Hannah Arendt's distinction, let us call being free in republican democracy as informed by the spirit of freedom, and let us call being free in liberal democracy's way the spirit of liberty. Yeah. So freedom and liberty, I think these are two words that you can contrast to each other. Liberty is obviously centered around the will in its Lockean formulations about an equality that springs from self-ownership. And the will also prevails in Kantian formulations about an equality that springs from the categorical imperative. For the categorical imperative too begins with the individual will and only subsequently goes on to impose limits on that will when it meets another will-bearing individual, or in the modern reformulations of Kant that seek to make space for non-human animals, another animate being. By contrast, the moral equality involved in Republican democracy springs from a theme that is present in Kant, but it's perhaps made even more, that is made even more prominent, which is the spirit of conscience, which is another of Gandhi's translations of the word antaratma, inner voice, right? Unlike will, right? Because will presumes that I'm a unified being who acts on the world, right? Conscience actually says quite the opposite. Conscience begins with the assumption that I'm not a unified being. I'm internally divided, right? And I have a conscience begins with the relationality with oneself, which precedes the will, and which is itself generated by a relationality with the world, or relation with the world. And Republican democracy is that activation of conscience where I recognize my relationship with you as a moral equal, and so accord you also a political equality. That is to say, the power to equally participate in the quilting the political, and this political equality necessarily follows here from moral equality. Now, so that's a broad sketch of Republican democracy. Now, I don't need to tell you, I think, that this thumbnail sketch is not how Republican democracy has worked at any time, anywhere. Because certainly not in the United States or India, the two places that are home for me. But my point here is not that the focus on the actual functioning of Republican democracies, but on the aspirational focus. It is this aspirational focus that makes Gandhi demand parliamentary swaraj. It is this aspirational focus that is at the heart of the Indian Constitution. Because this aspirational focus seems so desirable, right? I say aspirational rather than idealistic because when you have an aspiration, you try to embody it, right? Ideals are can be just empty, right? And aspiration is something that you shape yourself towards. It is because aspirational focus seems so desirable, especially at a time like this when India is grievously threatened by supremacist racism. I've written about supremacist racism elsewhere. We may be well tempted to ask, why do we need to question Republican democracy? Is not the problem really that we have not realized Republican democracy, that it has been suborned first by liberal democracy and now by supremacist racism? And the answer to that would be no. Yes, of course. I mean, I'm not saying that Republican democracy is not at all necessary. I mean, after all, let's not forget that Gandhi himself asked for it. We'll come back to this question. But the point is that Republican democracy does not get rid of the will as a faculty. In fact, it in some ways strengthens the will. It only complements and sometimes occasionally supplements the will. And here it helps to recall a wry remark that Hannah Arendt makes, that there is something paradoxical about a freedom based on a faculty whose essential activity consists in dictate and command. The will is born in self-mastery, and the will works through a mastery of means needed to achieve the end. Will also strengthens a particular concept of reason, right? Where effectively not the substance, where what is strengthened is effectively not the substantial reason anguished by ethical questions. That's the will of Republican democracy. But the instrumental reason that simply determines what is the most effective means to an end. In other words, while a Republican democracy certainly tempers liberal democracy by separating will from authority, while a Republican democracy is certainly preferable to tyrannies that ride roughshod over, the separation of wills, even. While it is certainly preferable to the fusion of will and authority involved in supremacist racism, it is nevertheless profoundly violent in ways that we know well. Think of how rule is here, even in the best circumstances, only in the name of an unmarked majority. Right? So Republican democracy, despite its best efforts, can often slide into majoritarianism, even a majoritarian racism. Because Gandhi is acutely aware of this violence, he describes this kind of democracy as involving an equality of the sword. So that's the second question that I've been dealing with, again, very schematically. On to the third question. What would be involved in a politics that relinquishes the will? Right? This is where we get really to what we describe as Gandhi's politics. But strictly speaking, even a politics of Republican democracy is very much part of Gandhi, because don't forget that Gandhi leads the Congress most of his life, and he acknowledges all the time that the Congress wants parliamentary swaraj and not his swaraj. Right? Now, the politics that relinquishes the will is what Gandhi describes as true swaraj. And as he writes about it, he is drawn to, quote unquote, religion. He can think true swaraj only in terms of, quote unquote, religion. Nor is he alone in this. The most intense political actors of this politics that relinquishes the will have also been drawn to religion. Think, for example, of Ambedkar and King. So the question is, what is the work that religion does? Why is religion so important here? Right? And I will say I find this especially interesting because I was brought up as an atheist. I remain an atheist, and though I now find the word atheist inadequate, but still, broadly speaking, I remain within that spirit. And that is why I think this idea of religion and the religiosity, so to speak, even of democracy, is something that I find interesting, because it allows me to rethink what is meant by religion. So here we may first take a cue from what Gandhi says in Anashakti Yoga, that the Gita is not a historical work. By this he means that, as he puts it just a while later, quote unquote, the persons therein described may be historical, but the author of the Mahabharata has used them only merely to drive home his religious theme. The contrast between religion and history is also implicitly, I would say, a contrast between two different kinds of time, right? In the sense that he's using it here, a historical work is something that places something in an empirical and calendrical time, whereas, or tells a story that unfolds in such time, right? And when Gandhi says that the Gita is religious, he means that it exists outside this kind of time. There are many ways of being outside this kind of time. Perhaps Gandhi is aware of this too, which is why he insists that the Anashakti Yoga is not an aphoristic work, which would aphorism would be one way of being outside this time. It is a great religious poem. So the question is, what is this religious time that Gandhi is contrasting to both empirical and aphoristic time? To answer this question, we could again take a cue from a remark made by Lefort, right? And I'm quoting him now. What philosophy discovers in religion is a mode of portraying or dramatizing the relations that human beings establish with something that goes beyond empirical time and the space within which they establish relations with one another. Or again, he says it a little while later somewhat differently. Every religion states in its own way that human society can only open onto itself by being held in an opening it did not create. Philosophy says the same thing, but religion said it first, albeit in terms that philosophy cannot accept. To my mind, this is a very rigorous first approximation of both religion as a concept and of the affinity between philosophy and religion. It brings us to the sense in which Gandhi or King or Ambedkar or many others who are concerned with social justice find religion an unavoidable horizon. Right? It avoids also all those sloppy formulations which make a religion secularism contrast by treating religion as transcendent and secularism as immanent. That is how things appear within a simplistically secularist ideology, or that is how things appear to secularism itself, right? To uncritical secularism, to a secularism that is not critical of its own presumptions, let's say. It sidesteps also those accurate but still misleading formulations such as that by Talal Asad, which suggests that late 19th century anthropological and theological thought rendered a variety of overlapping social usages rooted in changing and heterogeneous forms of life into a single immutable essence, and claimed it to be the object of a universal human experience called religious. Yes, of course, the concept of religion becomes modern when it is counterpointed to the secular and identified as a separate domain. But its modern remaking into a domain analogous to the domains of culture, the state, economics, etc., that modern remaking should not obscure from us the sense that that word, like analogous terms such as dharma, has arguably always carried the insinuation of the experience of another time, a time outside the empirical, which is nevertheless constitutive of our sociality. The experience of being held in an opening and a time that we do not create. We forget this only at our own peril. That's this concept of religion. But to recognize that philosophy and religion share something that sets them apart from the empiricality that marks history and myth, as also from the non-empiricality of the aphorism, is to arrive at another question: what distinguishes religion from philosophy? And of course, we can rattle off in our sleep philosophy's answer to this question, right? That philosophy opens society onto itself through reason, while religion opens society onto itself through belief or faith. Like all commonsensical answers, like all, this one intimates something important in an obscured way. Obscured because what I want to stress is what both faith and belief share, right? The sacred. Of course, it is no longer easy, at least in disciplinary circles, to associate religion with the sacred. Anthropologists and sociologists and others and historians have gone looking for the sacred and have become increasingly skeptical of it. The sacred, they have declared, is too crude a criterion of the religious. Yeah. That they have arrived at this finding is not surprising, for the sacred does not lend itself to being easily winkled out by the methodologies of empirical time that suffuse these ideologies. Right? The best way to get to the sense of the sacred involved in religion is by turning to the word sacrifice. Sacrifice is, of course, not only etymologically associated with the sacred. It is through sacred that it is through sacrifice that the sacred is performed, brought into being. Indeed, there is no religion without sacrifice and the sacred. Whether what is sacrificed is an enemy or the other, or oneself. I'm not therefore glorifying sacrifice. I'm just saying the sacrifice is what constitutes the sacred. And what I want to draw indeed, the moment we confront the sacred, we are no longer in the realm of the will. Because what we are in, we have surrendered our will, we act without will. And yet we act freely. Our relationship with the sacred is a free one. Something is sacred after all, only if we freely make it so. So now we can get a sense of why religion is so important to Gandhi. It is the action involved in religion. It is in the action involved in religion that we arrive at the threshold of the relinquishment of the will. Only the threshold. I will explain why later. I'm not saying that religion is necessarily the relinquishment of the will. I'm saying that it is a threshold of the relinquishment of the will. Right? To understand religion in terms of the sacred is also to recalibrate the usual distinction between religion and secularism, or for that matter, between religion and philosophy, right? But I don't want to get into that right now. I will just skip that since I'm already taken a fair amount of time. And I want to just stress that so far I've talked of sacrifice and religion, but if you're to get to what is distinctive about Gandhi's religion, then we also have to distinguish between two kinds of religiosity, which may as a shorthand be called theological and mystical, or as belief and faith. Both insist that societies open onto themselves by being held into an opening they did not create, they say the sacred, but they do so in entirely incommensurable ways. And to get at this incommensurability, it helps to revisit that old distinction between belief and faith. Belief is what we arrive at through institutionalized forms of knowledge. It is grounded. Central to belief is sovereignty, the sovereignty of the institutions of religion, the sovereignty of theology, the sovereignty of the divine, right? We use the word theologico-political to describe the modern state because it has taken over the sovereignty that had been provided by the divine, yeah? Theological religion calls for a profoundly and decidedly violent form of sacrifice. Sometimes it demands of its devotees a sacrifice of others, of those who have been deemed the enemy. Only through such sacrifice murder can the devotees of theological religion prove their fidelity to their God. Sometimes it demands even more of its devotees, their own lives. What marks theological religion in all its forms, including that of the modern nation state, is that it demands a surrender that is also a subordination. Devotees must not only surrender to, but also subordinate themselves to the divine. And here, even if devotees surrender their will, the sovereign does not. Indeed, the will persists, but now as a prerogative primarily of the sovereign. And to the extent that devotees sublate themselves into or realize themselves in the sovereign, they too partake in this sovereign will. As such, theological religion is not at all a politics of non-willing. Rather, it is merely the subordination of individual wills to a higher will, a will which moreover claims to fuse authority into it, where there's a moment where authority itself is dissolved into the will, right? If people like Gandhi and Ambedkar were so willing to embrace Republican democracy, despite their deep reservations about it, this was in no small part because they felt it would at least provide some respite from theological religion, from the religion of belief, the religion that the nation state can easily become because it provides for, can easily become. And Republican democracy does this because it provides for a separation of will and authority. It institutionalizes a separation of will and authority. As things have turned out, the respite has been too short. Both in India and elsewhere, Republican democracy is increasingly being done by authority, increasingly being undone by supremacist racism, right? Conceptually, supremacist racism can be involved as the concept of supremacist racism, that is Hindutva, can be described as involving a double fusion. On the one side, it vehemently denies and represses any differences within the people. As we saw, the ultimate source of authority for modern states. It insists that the people has a true form, and it claims to represent the people's will in its unicity. On the other side, it repudiates the separation of will and authority. It fuses the two together and insists that the will of the people is always already also their authority. Now, mystical religion is a different matter altogether. Though mystical is too positive a religion word, the mystical involves a moment of faith, a moment when a certain finitude and vulnerability is accepted not as a momentary risk before subsumption into the sovereign, but as a fact of life. Here, there is a surrender of the will, and this surrender is not subordination to a higher will. It is rather a persistence in surrender that refuses to accept determination by any will. This is why I've elsewhere described it as a surrender without subordination. Right? Surrender without subordination involves an altogether different kind of sacrifice. To begin with, here sacrifice can only be self-sacrifice. To sacrifice the other, this would be already to act in a theological manner. If Gandhi is so fascinated by the Gita, this is because he reads in it. Arguably, he reads it very idiosyncratically, right? But that's not my concern here. He reads it as providing the protocols for a mystical sacrifice. Right? And crucial to this, as you know, is the key to this mystical sacrifice is arguably contained in the word Anasakti Yoga, right? He opposed especially those theological readings of the Gita, such as that put forward by Tilak, which suggested that even violent action was justified as long as it was not driven by a selfish desire for fruits. In other words, for Tilak, violence was justified if the fruit was to be reaped by the theological figure of the nation state. By contrast, what Gandhi stresses is swach sadhan, or pure means, not renunciation of fruit to a higher sovereign, but the abandonment of the very logic of thinking in terms of fruit or end. To reject fruit or end in this way is to be left to sacrifice as simply pure means. To offer action as pure means is to try and make the sacrifice into a pure gift, into something given and received, aneconomically. The emphasis on pure means is also what justifies Gandhi's politics of ahimsa or satyagraha. For a politics of faith, the end, which is another way of conceptualizing the sovereign, is constitutively unknowable. Faced with this constitutive unknowability, satyagrahis can only practice the pure means of satyagraha, which after, pure means of satyagraha, which after 1915 become increasingly interchangeable for words for Gandhi. Right. Now, there is a lot more I wanted to say about this, but I think I've already taken well over 45 minutes. So I think I will, maybe, how much more time can I take, Bindu?
Yeah, why not? I think it's, you can go another 5-10 minutes if it's okay. Sanjeev.
Okay, no,
yeah, please.
Because I know I've already reached the time that I'm supposed to take. That's why I'm kind of asking a question. Yeah.
No.
Okay, if that is fine.
Yeah.
Okay. So, amongst the striking moves that marks Gandhi's politics is the way that for him, pure means is not a philosophical abstraction, but part of the everyday life, not just of satyagrahis, but of ordinary people, right? Already in Swaraj, there is the implication that satyagraha, which in its limited sense means resistance to injustice, and its broader sense means the practice of pure means, is already practiced in families, sometimes, if not always. And that what the editor is suggesting is that this practice be carried over to a wider field. How is pure means practiced in intimate relations? I think it is arguably in friendship that we can discern the protocols of pure means. What sets friendship as a concept apart from all other intimate relationships, after all, is that friends are equals. More than any other loving relationship, one is free with friends, even when one is commanding them. And one is free with friends not by being in a will relationship, not by insisting on one's rights in relationship to friends, as you know, rights have no place in friendship, but by the enactment of a certain surrender. And there is no purpose or instrumentality in friendship. We enjoy friends for themselves. Moreover, while this surrender leaves us vulnerable to friends, here vulnerability is itself also a distinctive power over our friends. Distinctive because it is exercised through an authority that has nothing to do with the will. One way of describing satyagraha is that it transposes the spirit of friendship to non-intimate relationships. As such, it could be described as a political friendship or democratic neighborliness, friendship with neighbors, especially the marginalized and the strange amongst them. In Gandhi's writings and politics, this kind of neighborliness displaces the figure of the universal human. And increasingly, comes to, this is why in his Swaraj, the editor attacks the impulse to serve every individual in the universe and insists on the primacy of quote unquote immediate neighbors. This is why he defines Swadeshi as the quote unquote spirit in us, which restricts us to the use and services of our immediate to the exclusion of the more remote. So this kind of democratic neighborliness is itself a discipline, and its rigorous practice has a distinctive fruit. An authority that, like the authority involved in intimate friendship, has nothing to do with the will. It is this authority that Gandhi sought to exercise in his fasts and marches, whether rightly or wrongly, I will not get into here. The fast against mill workers in Ahmedabad, the fast against separate electorates, the Salt March, the Noakhali marches, etc. One should add, as the memory of the fast against separate electorates should suffice to remind us, surrender without subordination of pure means does not by itself lead to a correct decision, right? This is so in two senses. One is that of misrecognition. For example, imperfect discipline can lead practitioners to not recognize that what they think of as their surrender without subordination is actually nothing of that sort. Then also in every situation, surrender without subordination can lead to divergent decisions. Gandhi himself recognizes the many divergent right responses in the context of Harish Chandra raising his sword on Taramati. He could raise his sword, Gandhi says, in the first instance because he loved her so greatly as to make the refusal to do so an act of self-interest, as to make the act of raising the sword itself one of self-sacrifice. Gandhi notes that Harish Chandra would have preferred to sacrifice himself if this had been possible. But if no self-interest had been involved, if she had not been his queen, if Harish Chandra had been repelled by the deed itself, then his hand would have refused to obey him and he would have resorted to satyagraha. This is what Gandhi writes. In other words, and whichever way Harish Chandra acted, he'd have been resorting to satyagraha in the broader sense of action as pure means of surrender without subordination. So surrender without subordination does not describe the correct decision. This is as it should be. Save in very simple cases, if such exist, no morality can tell us what our decision should be in a singular situation. Every morality can only tell us the broad contours of how to make a decision, leaving open an entire sheaf of actions quite compatible with those contours. Thus, Gandhi made innumerable decisions that we would vehemently disagree with. I cannot stress this enough. Most of all, it is in retrospect, it is evident that the exercise of the considerable authorities, discipline garnered for him, he was insufficiently insensitive to the question of how it would be received by how it would be experienced by those at its receiving end, whether it be experienced by them as dominating them. Nor even can one say that surrender without subordination is flatly nonviolent. Surrender without subordination is nonviolent only in this sense. It strives for finitude rather than the infinitude and mastery involved in the will. But is finitude always the most nonviolent form? What is the violence inherent in the practice of finitude? What I've tried to suggest elsewhere is that while a will-centered democratic politics is certainly more likely to destroy the world, right? Climate change, for example, it's certainly more likely to turn genocidal. It's certainly more likely to intensify structural violence. A politics of finitude is, or relinquishing the will, is not some already given template to be applied to existing situations. It poses its own challenge. It makes its own distinctive demands of thought. So I shall stop here since I've already gone on for nearly an hour. I must have spoken, I didn't. And I will not take up the fifth question, which is to say, what is the relationship between a will-centered politics and a politics that relinquishes the will? Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak and to share an essay that I'm writing right now. Thank you. Anyway, I'll stop here.
Sanjeev ji, I think your mic is off. Are you saying something?
Yes.
Your mic is off.
I'm so sorry. Professor Puri, we are awaiting your remarks on.
No, it's been a privilege, indeed an honor to listen to Professor Skaria. And like I said, I've been, reading not only his book, but also several papers. For instance, I've really been influenced, which he very briefly spoke about Gandhi on history here. And there is this paper he's done on the strange violence of Satyagraha, Gandhi, history and Itihas. And some part of that really helped me when, like I said, one of a book I'm writing, I have drawn in the first chapter on how you drew my attention to the ways in which Itihas and history differ. Though, of course, I think I'm much more in Gandhi's camp than you are, but it's very important for us to be able to take off from this critique. And also, I think in this talk today, a non-willing freedom, how Gandhi matters today, he's brought out, how important it is to look at the critique of Gandhi in a very different way. And I think in the process, the criticism from the left has come up, and it is inevitable, of course, that this criticism would be so as it is. Not only because of the reasons that Professor Skaria mentions, but also because Gandhi, kind of lends himself to this because of his continuity with the Indian tradition in several ways. For instance, with non-dualism, and the way that lends itself to difficulties of all kinds. For instance, the different levels of reality and so on and so forth, and all kinds of, I suppose, insidious hierarchies. And of course, there's also the non-insidious, I'll say, Jain tradition. And Akhil has made a lot of use of that with the reading of Gandhi's Truth as Relative. But I'd like to make another point that Gandhi is unique because he stands equally criticized by both the left and the right, and in the Indian context more so. And this too seems inevitable to me, given that he's challenging the orthodox readings of the Hindu tradition. So I think when Professor Skaria makes the point that Gandhi is orthodox, or when Kumar makes the point that Gandhi doesn't go far enough, I really I go back to Tilak's. I don't know where this is ringing. No, I don't know what's happening here. I think it's
My phone.
Is it from? 1 second. Is it from my side?
I don't know.
Where is this ringing? It's in the laptop.
I hope it's not my phone.
Oh, is it stopped? The phone is ringing here.
No, it's not. It's not my end.
I don't know. It's stopped now. Anyway, so I think that if we look at how he challenges the orthodox readings, for instance, if we compare with Tilak's work on the Gita, and you see how Tilak interprets the opening question and how Gandhi interprets the opening question. Tilak is saying that what Sri Krishna is telling Arjun is to, kind of do his duties of the caste. And Gandhi says, no, what Sri Krishna is saying is don't distinguish between kinsmen and others. So I see a lot of difference. I see that Gandhi challenges the orthodox on their own terrain and says, look, the way you read Hinduism is really not the way it should be read. So he does make a critique. Perhaps it doesn't go far enough, but there is a critique over there. So I think that both the left and the right have, critiqued Gandhi, and pretty equally vehemently. So actually in the coming book, I have sort of unpacked 8 arguments about equality that Gandhi reads into the Gita, which the orthodox wouldn't at all accept with. Now, in the talk, there is this questioning of a will-centered politics. And I think that's also coming from Professor Skaria's other work, Unconditional Equality. And there is this idea that Satya becomes synonymous with justice, and the demand for equality and against inequality becomes almost to being, and this Caesar is called Satyagraha. Now, what Satyagraha Caesar begins to involve comes from these 2 senses of Swaraj that you have pointed out. And Swaraj here, in one sense, is the self's rule over the self, and that becomes the rule of the proper, the Thikana. And that's really what makes Gandhi's Satyagraha about limits, about Had. And this is from where this Swaraj begins to involve, I suppose, surrender without subordination. And there's a groundlessness over here. And I think you trace it to the death of God, right? I mean, you don't think Gandhi is moving with God at all. And it's truth and not God. And the groundlessness actually makes it, I suppose, the sacrifice all the more tyrannical in a way. And it's a pure is an act of pure means, and there is really no end. Perhaps because God is not there. Am I correct?
Yes, I think I would completely agree there. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then I see that you instigate Aishwarya Kumar's argument to some extent, to me. And so I see that Kumar goes on to see that there is this kind of a force in Satyagraha, right? And the Agra. So I actually counterpose my reading, and I think that I think that the force, the imposition of limit, the had in Satyagraha, the groundlessness of sacrifice, I think it would dissipate a little bit if you would consider whether Gandhi's faith is really groundless. Because I wonder that for Gandhi, could there be faith which is held by the faithful to be groundless? I think for Gandhi, faith to be faithful has to be grounded in a kind of humbling belief, and ahimsa was eventually humility, in that which is beyond itself, that which is transcendent to human reality. So to me, it is important to understand that in the worldview of the ancients, within which Gandhi is self-consciously located, a lot follows from being a part of a wider cosmos where order is emerging from a ground other than the human. So to me, Gandhi's faith is resting in an absolute humility, and I think in a voice of God which is hearing and responding to, and of whom he's speaking in his comments on the Gita. So, I don't think it's a groundless faith. And so there is a problem for me. And so I can't go back, to the will to power, to the European tradition, to force, to interpret Agraha. Because I think Satyagraha could rest on what, for Gandhi at least, on what, no matter what insidiousness it gave to later, that Gandhi kind of thought that Satyagraha rests on the power of love to effect conversion of hearts. So that is deriving from the human being's love of God or truth. And I don't think the fact that he's equating it with truth really dissipates God, because you look at the Satyam Jnanam Anantam of this Vedic tradition. So I think he finds something there. And so I'm kind of wondering about this. And I also wonder if we can look at Satyagraha as compulsion, because I wonder if you can be compelled into transformation, which is what Gandhi is seeking to effect through love. And love is changing everything over here. It's not friendship. It's this love which is, freed from the boundaries of the family by the vow of brahmacharya, right? So there's no boundary anymore, but it's love still. And love is very different from friendship. So Gandhi kind of answered critics who opposed him accused him of coercion. And he said that, if I'm kind of looking for transformation, and if my fast is to be interpreted as pressure, I can only say that such moral pressure should be welcomed by all concerned. Now I'm wondering that if all moral encouragement or agraha and transformation is to be assimilated to will, to power, to force, we need
it's 9 o'clock.
Sorry.
I wonder, will not that be the complete dismissal of the moral life? Like Murdoch talks about this in some sense, about modern moral philosophy, right? So this is not something we can just completely do so uncritically. Consider what remains if Gandhi's kind of transformation and encouragement is to be understood as an exercise of power and not goodness. So it may come to pass that maybe we should turn to Hegel to locate the genealogy of Gandhi's emphasis on the conversion of the heart. One needs perhaps to recall traditional Indian accounts of tapas as making for that miraculous transformation. And I'm here thinking of this one quote which I really like in Gandhi, and I'm just going to read it. So he says, there's a certain rishi. The fire emitted from his brows put an end to all suffering. The point of this text is that when the soul becomes alive, all miseries end. And so the injustice perpetrated by the government will be no more when we become alive in our soul. We want happiness in place of the present misery. If so, we should suffer voluntarily, etc. So I don't know.
There is this romance in goodness, what Akil says. And maybe that's the kind of tradition that he's trying to unpack. So that's really how I would like to, though I'm dissenting, I'll say that Professor Skaria opens up the space. He clears that space for me to dissent. And so he always remains this, point where I come back again and again to see the counterpoint. So that's all really I have to say. And I want to thank him for this brilliant talk, always brilliant. And I want to thank Sanjeev ji for making this available for all of us here today. And it's been amazing listening to him. And again, so many new ideas. I couldn't organize them too well. Sorry, because I didn't have the paper before. But since I had read so much of his work, I could kind of trace where it's coming from. Thank you so much.
Thank you. No, thank you very much. I mean, should I respond or
yeah,
should I
why
wait?
not? I mean, if Sanjeev is okay with it.
Yeah, you can respond to her. And of course, after this, we will have few questions because there are
Questions.
the colleagues waiting, students are
No,
there.
I won't hog up any more time.
Yeah. So you can respond to her, and then of course we'll follow up with few questions.
Sure.
Yes.
Bindu, I mean, that is such a rich sheaf of questions you raised. And, let me begin by, and I mean, I think often I suspect it's not so much a disagreement as a difference of emphasis, right? And I also think that at least in the case of groundless faith, I would say that what I'm talking of is actually exemplified in the word love that you used, right? That is to say, what does it mean to talk of a grounded faith versus a groundless faith? I have a grounded faith in gravity, right? Because I mean, that's why I distinguish between belief and faith.
Yeah.
Right? Grounded faith is what I would call belief, and a faith that I cannot prove is what I call belief. Is what I call faith, right? So I have a belief in gravity. That is, I can show you that gravity exists. I can't, but I believe scientists can, right? I have, so anything that is grounded, whether in science or assuming that, say, for example, I believed in God, and I believed in God in the sense that I thought I can show to you that God exists. I'm actually puzzled that you can't believe in God. Then I would be having a belief in God, right? To have a faith is something different. It is to acknowledge that I cannot really give too many reasons for what I'm doing, right? And I think the act of love is a very good example of such a faith, right? If you ask me, why do I love somebody? I don't think I can really explain why I love somebody, right? I just love somebody or something without being able to give reasons for it. So I think love is perhaps always, the reason that this word love matters so much in so many of these religious traditions is perhaps because it always intimates this idea of a groundless faith. Yeah, this faith that, and I think in a way, if you think of it, what part of what I'm arguing in some of the stuff that I'm doing right now is that democracy itself involves a modulated version of groundless faith. If I'm to believe in the equality of all human beings, I mean, really, it's quite a leap of faith, right? What is there to make me believe in the equality of, we have not practiced that equality ever, more or less, right? That element of faith is absolutely crucial to any claim to the equality of human beings. So that's the sense in which I'm saying groundless. Yeah, that this idea that we stretch ourselves into a conviction that we cannot give grounds for. And when we recognize that our life is organized around such a stretching, right? Even though belief remains central to us, obviously, gravity, all of that, institutions of various sorts are grounded on belief. Then you have to really think of democracy itself as centered around faith when it functions, right? And this faith becomes especially acute in the moment of satyagraha, right? Where what the Satyagraha is trying to do is to treat as equal, as morally equal,
The
somebody who by any rational criteria has given up. Why should, say, MLK treat the KKK as morally equal, right? The KKK has very clearly shown that it is not morally equal, right? But to practice non-violent resistance against them is to treat as morally equal somebody who is by any rational criteria not morally equal, right? That's the element of faith. That's the element of groundlessness that I'm stressing very briefly. So.
No, wonderful, wonderful. I can take issue with you for a while, but I'm not going to. That's abusing my privilege. So I think, Sanjeev ji, please let the questions come.
Yeah, Priyanshu, may I request you to conduct the moderation for this question and
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you both of our honorable speakers for engaging us in such an enlightening and an illuminating session. We now proceed to the question and answer round. We would request all our participants to pose their questions in the chat box, and we'll appreciate them if they could come live on the camera and directly pose their questions to our honorable speakers. We hope that we'll be able to engage in more of the questions, and we request all our participants to pose their questions directly based on the theme. So we have questions on various themes. I'll start. The first question is from Shrishti Khare. She asks, don't you wish what Gandhi envisioned India after Swaraj is so different from what India has become now, after 75 years of independence?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I could not agree more. I think that is totally true, right? I think it's possible to distinguish between, between already, I think, at the time of his death, or even during his lifetime, I would say that the kind of politics that he envisioned was marginalized, but it was marginalized by something he respected enormously: republican democracy, right? That is why I think, I don't think we should forget that, Gandhi himself is quite supportive of parliamentary swaraj, right? What we have now is something that is giving up and that is actually destroying parliamentary swaraj itself. So yeah, I could not agree more that Gandhi's legacy is especially threatened today in terms of the attempt at a politics that is outside the will. I think what is one of the things that's striking about the politics that is, relinquishes the will is that it does not seek the state in the same way, which is why, after all, Gandhi suggested that the Congress dissolve itself, right? But it does not therefore reject the state, because, so that's why I'm stressing the difference between rejecting and relinquishing, right? Relinquishing is something that you do not in an act of will, but through what Bindu called tapas, through a certain discipline, right? So yeah, I think I would completely agree that today's what we see today bears no relation at all to what Gandhi saw, what Gandhi desired for. Yeah, I could not agree more.
Thank you, sir. We have next question, which two of them are quite similar, so I'll be clubbing them together. They ask, why do you think that Gandhi opposed the idea of separate electorates for the scheduled caste? Is there any reason behind it?
I cannot think of any reason that is defensible for his opposition to separate electorates. This is why one of the things, in fact, one of the things I was stressing in my talk is that I would find many of Gandhi's decisions indefensible, right? And to my mind, one of the interesting things about Gandhi is that, as with any complex tradition of thought, is that his own writing gives us the resources to thoroughly criticize his own decisions, right? That is to say, one could, even within Gandhi's own vocabulary, provide a very sharp and very thorough critique of what Gandhi did with separate electorates, right? That in some senses, this is exactly that he was behaving with Dalits in a way that was indistinguishable, perhaps in many ways, from the way that the British behaved with him, with the upper caste, right? So I think it is entirely possible to use. So what I would stress is not that Gandhi's decisions are correct. As I said repeatedly, the point about a politics of relinquishing the will is not that it leads to correct decisions. It's a different way of deciding, right? And it leads, one can criticize specific decisions as much. Yeah. I hope that answers the question, because I think this is, when we are dealing with people as thinkers, it's very, very important to remember that we treat them as generating questions for our times, right? Rather than as right or wrong, because, obviously, say, for example, if I think of most of the people whom I admire, I run into the same problem. I cannot defend most or significant portions of what Marx says, right? And Marx would be somebody whom I admire greatly, yeah. But that does not mean, therefore, that I abandon Marx, right? So that's the perspective from which, I think this is what is involved in treating people as thinkers. You think with them, not necessarily take up their specific positions for their rightness or wrongness, which of course is an important historical task, but it's not the same task as treating them as a thinker.
Of course, thank you, sir. Next question is also pertaining to caste. So the participant wishes to ask, do you think Gandhi was racist towards Africans, and why did he then accept caste system as a necessary thing?
Yes, I've actually written about this. I've written an essay called "What Gandhi's Racism Teaches Us About Anti-Racism Today." So yes, the brief answer to that would be yes, Gandhi was racist in his perspective till as late as 1913, and I think traces of that remain even in his later writing, right? And what is the second part of the question? Could you repeat the second part again?
Yes, sir. So the second part basically deals with why Gandhi accepted caste system as a necessary thing.
Right. Yeah. This is again one of those things where initially Gandhi very much believes in the caste system, and again I would stress that one can use Gandhi's own language and Gandhi's own terms to provide a criticism of him, which he increasingly moves towards, to be fair to him, though never as much as his own language would have allowed him to move towards. So he is very much initially about accepting the caste system, reading it as part of in his language, not, because I think this is very important to remember where he defends the caste system from too, because he defends it in his language, right, as a system of limits. Now, of course, when he sees it as a system of limits, what he's completely missing out on is that it's a system of oppression, right? And that there is, as so many people, beginning with Ambedkar, have pointed out so forcefully, right? This is to completely miss the point. So.
All right, sir. So then we move to the next question. The participant wishes to ask, can you ever achieve the enlightened society that would make the swaraj what Gandhi envisioned possible?
I think Gandhi himself would say no, right? That is to say, it is an aspiration. And because it's to the extent that one cannot realize it, that one always needs a state. But it is something, and as I stressed when I was talking, an aspiration is different from an ideal, right? An ideal is something that I just say, okay, it's my ideal. I have ideals. I don't necessarily have to live up to it. To embody in various, right? Even if in limited ways, even if in ways that keep it as a goal, but that's nevertheless shape who we are, right? So I would say Gandhi's politics is a politics, especially of non-willing, can always only be an aspiration, right? It will always have this problem of not realizing itself. And and one of the things that I think it's very similar to a lot of religious politics in that sense, because, say, for example, famously, most religious people think of themselves as not religious enough, right? And that is perhaps strikingly indicative of the way an aspirational politics works, right? what in aspirational politics works, the way it works is always by recognizing that this is what I've not yet done. So.
Thank you, sir. So we move to the next question, which has been posed by one of our participants. He asks, how the way India sees religion today, you think, is influenced by Gandhi's view on religion?
I would say that it is, as I've said, as I've argued in an essay recently, Hindutva is a making of Hinduism into a racism, right? I think in that sense, Gandhi, Hinduism, like all religious traditions, is a profoundly complex tradition with dimensions that are extremely violent and dimensions that question this violence. Right? Any contrast between Hinduism and good and Hindutva as bad is also inadequate. Right? Hinduism is too complex to be described as either good or bad, like any religion. What I was trying to point to is that central to religion is, as a concept, is the idea of the sacred, right? And within the sacred itself, one can point to two distinctions. One, between the sacred as belief, right? Where the sacred becomes something that is sovereign over me. And second, the sacred as faith, where the sacred is an existence of a surrender without subordination. And I think the sacred without faith, as faith, is central to some of the most fascinating moments in religion itself. Whether you think of moments in the Bhakti tradition like Kabir, one can think of so many others, but I'm just focusing on this one. So therefore, I think this emphasis on the difference between faith and belief is central to thinking of religion, as also the emphasis on the sacred. And recognizing that the sacred is what is crucial to religion will help us realize also that the nation state itself is not outside religion, because after all, what we are doing is we're making the nation state sacred, right? That's why I'm saying that the distinction between religion and secularism often does not work.
Okay, so that was quite of a thought-provoking answer in today's time. So the next question is regarding Gandhi's legitimacy. So the question is, people usually who question the legitimacy of Gandhi, that by his experiment of truth, where he experiments celibacy, was something unethical. Mm-hmm. So this is the question.
Yes, this is, and I could not agree more. As I said both at the beginning and at several times in the talk, that I am not interested in defending Gandhi's specific positions. Right? I think there are many specific positions that I would, recoil from thoroughly. Yeah, and I think getting caught up in defending his specific positions stops us from being able to engage with the questions that he raises when we think with him, right? Yeah, so I think very briefly, I think, there are many aspects, including some of his experiments, that I would take deep issue with.
All right, sir. So the next question is based again upon religion. So the participant asked, how do you think Gandhi's vision on religion can emancipate the human civilization from religious bigotry? Mm-hmm. And he also asked, how can his idea be implemented to end religious turmoil taking place in the country? How to use his ideas to bring religious harmony? So I think all these can be answered within one go.
Okay, that's quite a lot to answer. Let me try and just say that, look, first of all, what I was stressing is that what Gandhi brings out in religion is the aspect of religion called faith. What I would say even Republican democracy is on the side of faith in some ways, right? That is to say, rather than thinking of India as a secular state, which there is a certain sense in which you can use the word secular to mean to describe Nehru in India, or India till even the 2000s as a secular state, democratic secular states to be precise. But even democratic secularism involves a certain religiosity. It involves the religiosity of treating every human, every citizen as an equal, even though there are no grounds necessarily for doing so. Right now, so that kind of religiosity of faith is what is central to Satyagraha. Satyagraha carries a religiosity of faith to an extreme. Democratic systems, Republican democracy, is a more limited version of the religion of faith, right? By contrast, what something like Hindutva involves is an abandonment of faith altogether, right? And an association, a slippage instead into, a making of religion into belief, into something that is sovereign over us, and in the name of which we can kill and murder, right? So those are two very different understandings of religion, both of which share an emphasis on the sacred, but take the sacred in entirely different directions. What does Gandhi enable? How does Gandhi enable us to converse? Gandhi, to my mind, enables us to converse by stressing that, by allowing for this common space of the sacred within which conversation can take place, and then asking questions about what does it mean to sacralize, what does it mean to treat things as sacred, and what are we sacralizing, right? Can a Gandhian politics provide an alternative? Yes, it can, but obviously, like anything else, it's not a philosophy, right? What is interesting about one of the differences between a religion and a philosophy is that a religion necessarily involves practice. So yes, to the extent that one can practice this religion, yes, but it is not a philosophy that provides answers that we can, see as rational thinkers.
Can I just come in on that for 1 minute?
Sure, ma'am. Yes.
If you allow me. No, I'm just very intrigued by Professor Skaria's, going back to the sacred. And I'm reminded of Roger Scruton writing on the sacred. And, he says that sacred objects, words, animals, ceremonies, places. This is one of my very favorite things from Scruton. All seem to stand at the horizon of our world, looking out to that which is not of this world, because it belongs to the sphere of the divine, and looking also into our world so as to meet us face to face. So through sacred things, we can influence and be influenced by the transcendental. So I think in that sense, the sacred is this mediating thing. So if you bring down sacred objects and treat them as mundane, or treat the mundane as if it was the sacred, it won't do, because the sacred is the presence of the transcendental over here. It's the meeting ground. So that's really how the sacred is functioning. So this is the worldview of the ancients, where there is necessarily more than the human. This is what I feel. Anyway, I'm sorry I brought that up, but I just go back to, I just remembered Scruton over there. So sorry,
Sure.
just as another perspective.
Yeah. I would just add that I don't agree with Scruton that it's, I would say that the sacred is not necessarily transcendent. I would say that one
it's
of
like the meeting place. It's the window where we are kind of meeting the transcendental. So it's just like, for instance, Gandhi writes something beautiful about ritual. He says, like I read, it's in the Gita, I think, that, there's really nothing to it, the way you pour the water and you do this and that. But it's just music, because it just makes sense in that worldview. So you pour the water on the betel leaf and you put the nut and everything. And too, that this is just an act, but it becomes the way that the divine is kind of with you. All I'm trying to say is that this is the worldview where there is this much more than us.
Yes. And there I would completely agree.
Yeah,
I would completely agree that there is this much more. Only I would say that, look, the sacred can be very dangerous too, right? Say, for example, nationalism is the making of the nation into a sacred object.
But it's not really, it can never be. To do that is to do violence to the sacred, because you cannot, the nation, can represent the mother goddess cult, but it won't be the sacred, because it's not a window by which you're engaging with the transcendent, is it? In the sense in which, let us say, the idol in the temple is. It is a proof of the presence of God. So even Sri Aurobindo, who's talking about the nation's soul, is not saying it's sacred. He's just saying it's something, his argument is very similar to Herder, actually. He's just saying it's a particular self-expression. And the world is made richer by these self-expressions. So just keep this diversity. But he's not saying that it's sacred.
I would prefer to stick with the etymological description of sacred. That is to say, sacred and sacrifice share etymological similarity, right? And sacred is that which calls forth sacrifice from us. In other words, and sacrifice is very important, because when I sacrifice something, that means that I am giving up on something. I'm no longer acting by my own will.
Yeah, relinquishing the will. So we're just reading it very differently now. That's the thing. Sorry. Go back to your question.
No. I think these are very important differences and distinctions to make.
So like Akhil says, it's not, none of us have got him right. It's just important that we are engaging with him.
Yes.
And that's okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir and ma'am, for such profound discourse. So the next question is on Gandhi's political ideas. So the participant poses, can we agree with the lapse of time, Gandhi's political ideas that are laced with utter indifference, nurtured on purpose?
Laced with utter? I missed the last
indifference. Nurtured on purpose to demand more acceptance.
I definitely think Gandhi is absolutely relevant today, and that we have, perhaps been too quickly indifferent to him. Some of this indifference is entirely justified, because part of the problem is that his specific positions are very, very difficult to accept, are impossible to accept, I would say often, right? The challenge of looking beyond those specific positions to what is involved in a politics that relinquishes the will is part of what I'm trying to engage in, and what I think Bindu is also trying to engage in, and so many others are trying to engage in. Yes, I don't think. I honestly cannot see how anybody can today defend many of Gandhi's positions, right? Which are sexist, which are upper caste, right? In ways that are, so evident, right? That I think it's impossible to defend. Right? And that's why I think getting into defending them would be pointless.
Thank you, sir. We would like to ask our participants to come live on camera if they wish to direct their questions to our speakers directly.
Hello, sir. Good morning, sir. Good evening, ma'am. I would like to pose a question to sir, asking that according to Gandhi, what would be the definition of a nation? And in his idea of things, what we today consider as a nation as a kind of belongingness, as a uniting force. According to him, why would he think like India is a nation and uniting force in spite of our great cultural diversity? Thank you.
That's a wonderful question. That's actually a question that I'm writing an essay about, because one of the phrases that I use is democratic neighborliness, right? And, one of the ways that Gandhi talks of swaraj, of Swadeshi, I think is very interesting here, which is to say that it is about caring for those around us, for our neighbors. one of the things that, and he says, a neighbor is those who are physically near, right? But also those who are mentally afar. Yeah. So especially amongst the neighbors, those who are mentally afar. Right? So in a sense, I think what is interesting about Gandhi is that he's not as interested in the statist definition of the nation. Right? Now, I think what is important about Gandhi is also that he recognizes that, look, a statist definition is in some ways unavoidable. Right? But because his is an aspirational politics rather than a totalizing, universalizing politics, what he focuses on is what does it mean for us as individuals and groups to accept this democratic neighborliness. And his argument would be that, look, if the more of us who practice democratic neighborliness, the more the statist conception will become secondary, right? Even if one can never entirely do away with it, right? That's why, again, I'm stressing the word relinquishing rather than rejecting, right? He does not reject the state, he relinquishes the state. And obviously one can relinquish the state only to the extent, I think a story that I say all the time, and I think I'm kind of, is the example of Gandhi, and to explain what is relinquishing is the example of Gandhi being asked by an associate, where that, look, you told me I should not complain to the police if there's robbery in my house, but there has been a robbery, and I feel like complaining, but I haven't complained because you told me not to. And Gandhi tells him that, look, if you feel like complaining, you should complain. The point is to not feel like complaining, right? And that is the crux of relinquishing, right? That, if you feel like complaining, you should complain. So if you want a state, you should have a state. The point is to not feel like having a state. That is the sense in which I'm calling it an aspirational politics, right? And an aspirational politics of democratic neighborliness would therefore not reject the state as much as relinquish it through everyday practices. Yeah. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yes, sir, it does to a great extent. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Yeah. If you have any further clarification, I'd be glad to try and make it. So.
So the next question is from the chat box. So the participant wishes to ask, what was the reason that Gandhiji opposed mechanization? Should we follow his opposition to machines in modern times when industries play an important role in development of our country?
Yes, that's an excellent question. That's a very, very important question. Let's shift from mechanization to what mechanization exemplifies, right? Mechanization exemplifies the institutionalization of abstract relations between us. And if I have abstract relations with you, then I don't engage with you directly. I engage with you through a means. Now, I think Gandhi himself, towards the end of his Swaraj, he's asked, look, you've been criticizing the printing press, you've been criticizing machines, but you're using the printing press yourself, right? And Gandhi says that, yeah, I mean, I would say that I need to use it because, sometimes you need to use this to even attack it. So I think there is enough in Gandhi to say that one should oppose mechanization or abstract relations in principle. But, unlike Gandhi, I would also stress, and again, I think not entirely unlike in vocabulary that I think Gandhi, one can derive from Gandhi. One should also at the same time see to what extent is it necessary. If you think of abstract relations, if you think of mechanization as abstract relations, then parliamentary swaraj and republican democracy is itself a form of abstraction, right? Because if you think of what does it mean to vote, I am not voting as me, Ajay, Skaria, and when a representative speaks for me, the representative is not speaking for me, right? There is me as one unit amongst several thousand. I have been abstracted from my identity to be made into an abstract unit when I go to vote, right? So a certain abstraction, if you want to use the word mechanization, a certain mechanization is central even to parliamentary democracy as an institution. No, parliamentary democracy as an institution, this is what distinguishes it from, this is what distinguishes representative democracy from direct democracy. Right? So I would say that there is no way that we can ever get rid of abstraction. What a perspective that is rooted in questions that Gandhi gives us, and I say questions that Gandhi gives us, not the answers, right, is a perspective that is skeptical of abstraction, that is aware of the violence of abstraction, and therefore constantly seeks to relinquish abstraction. Does that make sense again? I hope.
Thank you, sir. We move to the next question, and the participant asks that Gandhi has been widely popular during the national movement within the Indian masses and also after independence. So why is that the idea of decentralization was accepted only after the 1990s?
I wouldn't say the idea of decentralization was accepted even after the 1990s. So, you know, and I think that is one thing to remember. The second thing is that I think during most of the nationalist movement, Gandhi functioned more as an icon than as somebody whose ideas were effectively implemented, right? And I think this is very, very important to remember. In fact, Gandhi himself comes to feel this towards the 1940s. Sudhir Chandra has this very moving book on Gandhi's last years, you know, when he's discovering his own ineffectuality. So I would say that Gandhi's politics was always marginal despite his iconic importance. Was always, you know, but it was certainly far more influential then. And I think what is important about Gandhi's politics and what makes it so difficult to practice often, but all the more necessary to practice, especially in our time of climate change, is that Gandhi's politics involves a questioning of the self, right? That is why I think one of the most important words that he gives us is you know, conscience, antaratma, right? Because there is a rightness and wrongness that is involved in his politics that I cannot stress enough. A rightness and wrongness that we must always question ourselves about. One of the ways of describing Gandhi's politics, you know, this is why I am writing in an essay that currently that one can talk of a parallax relationship between Gandhi and Ambedkar. That is that they both share an emphasis on the figure of the minor. You know, and what I mean by the minor is that you know, minor is slightly different from minority, though it's connected, of course. The minor is those who are in a relatively powerless situation in society because of who they are. So any figure becomes a minor when they experience that kind of discrimination. So, I mean, very, very crudely speaking, one can distinguish between the discrimination one experiences because of what one is and the discrimination that one experiences because of who one is, right? So there is a discrimination that one experiences, say, because one is a migrant worker. And that is, in some senses, almost a position of what. There is a discrimination that one experiences because one is a Dalit or one is a woman. And that is a discrimination that one could describe as a discrimination faced because of who one is. The two are, of course, tied together, as we know only too well, right? The two are, of course, often coterminous, right? But conceptually, we need to distinguish between the two. And the minor is the figure who experiences discrimination because of who they are, right? Now, you can be experiencing discrimination because you speak up for individual rights, right? You can experience discrimination because you speak out against CA, NRC, right? Again, then you're experiencing discrimination because of who you are. You can experience discrimination because of your caste identity. You can experience discrimination because of your gender identity, your sexual identity, right? all the situations where one experiences discrimination because of who one is what I'm describing as constitutive of the figure of the minor. Right. Now, what is interesting about this is that a minor politics would be a politics that says, look, I don't want to be part of the majority. I want to preserve this position as a minor and still not experience discrimination. Right. So that would be the crux of a minor politics. So in that sense, a minor politics is almost a moral play, is making a morality out of being minor. One way of describing parliamentary swaraj is that it is the rule of the majority in a way that is sensitive to the minor. Right. That's why to describe parliamentary swaraj or as majority rule is inadequate. Right. And perhaps this is the connection, the reason why people like Gandhi and Ambedkar, who are very, very critical of parliamentary swaraj in many ways, Ambedkar, but are nevertheless supportive of it because they see in it the possibility of institutionalizing mechanisms for the minor. Right. As contrasted to majoritarianism or supremacist racism, both of which I wrote about very recently in an article in The Wire, which you can read, where both of them are about the rule of the majority that rides roughshod over the minor. So in that sense, I would say that Gandhi's very much about a certain kind of politics of the minor. And Gandhi says explicitly that, look, the idea that almost always it's the minority that's right. It's almost never the majority. It's always the minority that's raising the most important ethical questions. Right? So.
Thank you, sir. So we move to the next and the last question for this session. So the participant wishes to ask that he finds a distinction between what Gandhi preached and practiced. For him, Gandhi seemed to be a strong supporter of Chatur Varnya. However, he still finds that there was a difference between what he preached in terms of his idea on caste.
I would say that, I would not see a difference between what Gandhi preached and practiced. I would see that there are profound inadequacies and there's a very strong critique necessary, and that has been done already in many ways of Gandhi's concepts of caste. But I would not say that there's a contrast between what he preached and practiced. Right? Let us not forget that, even as he, talked of Chaturvarnya, first of all, he moved from that, especially increasingly from the 1930s onwards, right? Partially because of Ambedkar's critique. He never moved enough. That's a different matter. But I would say that the critique has to be not for hypocrisy, because I don't think hypocrisy is a useful term to use for him, but for the way he did not take his emphasis on his own categories seriously enough to see what it would mean to empower the Dalit, right? So it is that kind of critique that I think is more valid than the critique of hypocrisy, than the critique in terms of hypocrisy, right? So.
All right, sir. So I believe this answers the participant's question. So if time permits, can we take just one last question?
I can go on as long as you want. It's you guys who have that.
I think Priyanshu, just the last question.
It's the morning for me, it's the evening for you. So
yeah, please take the last question.
So this is the last question. So the participant asked, what was Gandhi's Ram Rajya? Because according to him, Ram Rajya was about a monarchy and lower caste were not allowed to study in a Ram Rajya. So what was Gandhi's take on Ram Rajya?
Well, I think that's a very important question. I've actually written about this. I've got an essay called Relinquishing Republic and Democracy, where I write about this. And I think it's very, very important to remember that he's using these terms metaphorically and religiously. This is why he keeps insisting that, look, I'm not using these terms historically, right? And I think the metaphorical implications of the word are what he's drawing on, right? And as a metaphorical term, right, what he means by that is a system or a social order that does not have the state at its center. Can one do this? Can one take out Ram Rajya in that way? I think yes, because I think I don't want to get into the specifics of the word Ram Rajya itself, but I think every word that we have comes with a baggage. There is no word that is totally innocent, right? If I say democracy, one can immediately say that, look, democracy means enslavement of the African Americans. After all, that was inseparable from democracy for a long time, right? So words are our inheritance. Every word is a messy inheritance. There is no pure inheritance possible. It is our task as inheritors to shape these terms in our society in the way that we want, right? And that is something that's very, very important for us to remember if we are trying to conduct a politics where we try and engage with people also from where they are, right? Say, for example, if I go and use, I would think of myself as very much a socialist. I think I sometimes wonder, I'm based in the US, I sometimes wonder whether I should use the word socialism in the US, right? Because sometimes some words get so, I would think of myself actually as even more of a communist than a socialist, right? Or at least very deeply influenced by communist ideas. But I think if I go and tell in the US that, look, I'm a communist, I might actually lose the ability to speak to a lot of people, right? So that there may be a sense in which we also begin by putting our vocabulary, our words in language that is accessible and that also speaks to a common ground. I think the speaking to a common ground is absolutely essential to any practical politics. Right? Have I lost everybody or?
Oh, you are audible.
Thank you, sir. So I think with this, we come to the end of this session. Now I would like to invite our convener, Professor Sanjeev Kumar, to give a vote of thanks.
Thank you, Priyanshu, for this important session. I think there has been a lot of takeaway from this discussion, and I cannot thank enough the two speakers, Professor Ajay Skaria and Professor Bindu Puri, who have spared their invaluable time and have been a part of this important discussion. The lecture, I think, has been a very insightful and thought-provoking. In fact, it has thrown many questions. We have truly benefited from this talk because I believe, Professor Skaria, the way you elucidated on the idea of will-centered politics, I think in the discourses of politics, we often, miss out such ideas. Your very simple words, you elucidated upon the limitations, of the dominant Western liberal canon, particularly that came from the Enlightenment tradition, where the core liberal categories of equality and liberty, you suggest, and if I'm not wrong, they need fresh cards, to make a understanding of true sense of what autonomy, sovereignty, freedom, true freedom can actually mean to us. I think in that context, your lecture draws upon the importance of Gandhi's a very deeper philosophy of Satyagraha, where you brings this idea of surrender without subordination. I think that's very important. I think this is often misunderstood, by both, who work with Gandhi, their ardent supporters, and of course, the critiques also. And that is where I think the simple, categories or the words that use like faith, belief, uh, non-violence, they need to be deeply problematized in order to get a deeper sense of what Gandhi actually wants to convey to us. And that I think will make Gandhi more relevant to us, unlike the way we engage Gandhi in the polemics. And that's where I think the questions sometimes are often in that frame, which comes to us. I think that's where your discussion, I think we have all been deeply benefited through this discussion. Thank you, Professor Skaria, for sparing your valuable time for this webinar. I know it is early in the morning, and particularly I know of friends in the West, they would like to get up, late in the morning. But I think that's where I see that discipline, the commitment coming from you. Very happy to see you here, sir. In fact, I can't thank enough Professor Bindu Puri. She has always been there supporting us, and she enriched this discussion, with her critical insights and the knowledge in the subject. It was definitely a pleasure, ma'am, having you here. And I look forward to both of you in the future conversations and deliberations that we wish to organize. And maybe when the things improve after pandemics, it will be great to meet you in person, Professor Skaria. I think Professor Bindu Puri will be also very happy to see you doing that. I must thank my principal. Of course, he had to leave. He has always been very kind in supporting all our initiatives, all the academic and curricular activities of the department, the college. Professor K.K. Arora has been very generous. I could see many distinguished scholars, colleagues, guests, Professor Geeta Dharampal, George Paxton, many others. I've got the names. They joined from different parts of the country and abroad. We thank you all for joining this discussion today. We are truly benefited from the rich discussion that followed through this lecture. And of course, I wish to thank all the students, and the participants, research students, joined this discussion. The seminar would not be important without your presence. And much of this pain in organizing this initiative, has been taken by our, dedicated team of student, members who work, away from the limelight, and still they contribute to the running of this society. In particular, I would like to name them: Zoya, Ishani, Tushar, Priyanshu, who just did the moderation, Tanmay, Ankit, Srishti, and many others. They constitute a very important pillar, and therefore I think they deserve special mention for this. And in Dr. Shravana and Dr. Tripta, Dr. Asta Walam, they find very valuable guidance and support, through the faculty, staff of Gandhi Study Circle. Thank you, all of you. I think the success of this event will motivate to carry such initiatives, with your cooperation and support. I look forward to seeing you all in the next series of lectures that we plan to have in the near future. Thank you, Professor Ajay Skaria, Professor Bindu Puri, again for your generosity and support. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was really a pleasure. Thank you, Bindu, for your questions.
Thank you. I think I'll get the email from Sanjeev, and we can talk over email.
Yeah.
Yes, that'll be wonderful.
Yeah, just a last request. The students wants a photograph. If it was a normal activity, you could have all come together. So now there is this, understanding that all of them will come live on the camera and we'll just click one picture. So please come on the camera, all of you. This will be the memory that we'll carry forward.
Absolutely.
Thank you all. So may I request all of you to please come. I could see Dr. Y.P. Anand also now. I could see him also. He has been there coming for seminars, contributing to the rich Gandhian legacy, and many others. So thank you all for joining us this lecture today. And Professor Skaria, we look forward to have you in our future initiative. And of course, Binduji always is here with us, and I think I will always, come after you for any such engagement. So thank you all, and again, a very good evening to all of you in India, and of course, Professor Ajay Skaria.
A good day.
Very good day to you. Thank you all.
Good evening to you too.
Yeah. This concludes the day, the evening. Thank you all.
You. Okay.
Okay, bye. Bye.
And then we would like to request all our participants to fill out the feedback form. Thank you.
Thank you, Priyansh.
So,
thank you, sir.
thank you. Bye.
Bye, sir.